Upon her apprehension by two officers, they were unaware that they would encounter her once more, this time in court, as the judge would determine their fate. Fort Collins, Colorado, experienced a sunny afternoon. The park was a hive of activity, with families picnicking under the shelter of tall oak trees, joggers pacing along the trail, and children playing. A black woman sat on a bench near the pond, a hefty hardcover book resting on her knee, amidst this bustling yet peaceful scene. Camille was a highly esteemed attorney who was taking a rare break from her demanding schedule. The sharp squeal of tires interrupted her concentration as she was engrossed in her reading. A few observers were drawn to the scene when a police cruiser approached the curb. Two officers emerged, their expressions stern and authoritative. Camille was the sole individual in the proximity who was sitting alone, and their eyes immediately focused on him. One of the officers called out, "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" His voice was tinged with suspicion rather than concern. Camille's composure was unyielding as she lifted her eyes from her book. "Certainly," she replied, meticulously closing the volume. The second officer approached with a reticent demeanor. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Camille raised an eyebrow, evidently perplexed. She held up the book as if to substantiate her assertion, but their scrutiny remained unwavering. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." The initial officer inquired, "May we request to see your identification?" She maintained her composure, despite the fact that her pulse increased. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" The second officer stated, "It is routine," although his demeanor suggested otherwise. The small throng that had assembled began to murmur. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances, perceiving the imbalance in the interaction, while others appeared curious. Camille sighed and reached into her purse, removing her wallet. The officer who received her driver's license conducted a superfluous scan of the information as she surrendered it. "Camille Johnson," he read aloud, his tone bordering on mockery. "What's your business here, Miss Johnson?" Camille attempted to maintain her composure by inhaling deeply. "I live in this city. I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" The officer's jaws contracted. "We'll see." He returned her identification card. However, they persisted in their lingering, inquiring about matters that appeared to be less routine and more akin to interrogation. One officer sneered, "Do you consistently carry a book like that?" His hand was resting on his belt in an unmistakably deliberate gesture, as he inquired, "Are you alone here, or are you waiting for someone?" Camille had managed numerous tense situations in courtrooms, however, this was an exception. Their tone was reminiscent of an edge that she was all too familiar with, and the power dynamic was stark. Nevertheless, she exercised caution when selecting her remarks. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she asserted with determination. Her refusal appeared to elicit an emotional response from them. The initial officer emerged. He retorted, "Do not be so clever with us. We're just doing our job." Camille responded, "And I am aware of the law." Her voice was composed. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." However, they did not prioritize rationality. The initial officer reached for her arm. "You are resisting," he stated, despite Camille's failure to move. She exclaimed in astonishment, "What are you doing?" The volume of the crowd's murmurs increased. The scene was captured by a man who retrieved his phone. The officer repeated, this time raising his voice, "Stop resisting," as if to entertain the expanding audience. Camille's pulse pounded as she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around her wrists. She endeavored to maintain her composure, despite the fact that she was consumed by feelings of humiliation and frustration. The officers directed her toward their cruiser, disregarding the inquiries of bystanders. Camille directed her gaze upon the throng, where she engaged in conversation with a young woman who was holding her phone aloft. Momentarily, there was an unspoken exchange, a silent appeal to record the injustice that was taking place. However, Camille was aware that this was not the conclusion of the narrative as the car door closed. It was merely the beginning. The police cruiser's confined backseat was the scene of Camille's mind racing. She had dedicated years to the defense of clients, advocating for justice, and navigating the legal system. However, she was now on the other side of it. She was impressed by the absurdity of the situation, however, there was no humor in it, only anger. The silence during the journey to the station was oppressive, with the exception of the occasional crackling of the police radio. Camille gazed out the window, her reflection blending with the passing landscape. Her wrists were aching due to the cuffs digging into her epidermis. The situation at the station only deteriorated. The booking procedure was designed to deprive her of her dignity, was invasive, and humiliating. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and directed to a compact holding chamber that was illuminated by fluorescent lights that hummed incessantly. One of the officers said triumphantly, "Enjoy your stay," as he closed the cell door. Camille's hands were clasped firmly in her lap as she sat on the frigid bench. She repeatedly relived the events that transpired at the park in her consciousness. How did this tranquil moment devolve into this? The response was as unambiguous as it was bitter: prejudice. It was hours before anyone again acknowledged her. A clipboard was held by a youthful officer as he approached the cell. "Miss Johnson, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he stated without hesitation. Camille's voice was more emphatic than she had intended, as she inquired, "On what grounds?" "You may address that matter in court," he replied before withdrawing his hand. She exerted herself to think strategically as she exhaled slowly. The allegations were tenuous, and she was aware of this. However, she was aware that the battle that lay ahead would be difficult. Cases similar to hers were exceedingly uncommon. Camille was ultimately granted bond and released. The cool night air struck her like a wave as she exited the station, which was in glaring contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside. Marissa, her colleague and acquaintance, was observed waiting by the curb. Marissa hurried over, her expression a blend of relief and apprehension. "Camille. Are you okay?" Camille's body exhibited a minor tremor, despite her nodding. Despite the hollowness of the word, she replied, "I am fine." Marissa continued to observe her as they drove away, anticipating her response. Camille finally broke the silence. "I'm not letting this slide, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa's grasp on the steering wheel became more rigid. "What are you thinking?" Camille responded, "I am beginning to feel weary of this situation. I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back. And I will." Camille was seated at her kitchen table that evening, surrounded by open books and legal pads. She labored tirelessly, formulating a civil rights lawsuit against the department and the officers. Her hands trembled, but not out of dread, but rather from a simmering resolve. The community began to unite around her as the days progressed into weeks. The young woman in the park had shared the video of her arrest, which had gone viral. Individuals from all aspects of life responded with messages of encouragement, recounting their own experiences of injustice. Camille's resolve was fortified by each email, phone call, and comment. She was not solely advocating for herself. She was advocating for all individuals who had been suppressed, humiliated, or dismissed. However, she was unable to anticipate the moment when justice would take an unexpected turn, even as she prepared for the courtroom conflict. Camille was arrested, and the weeks that followed were characterized by a flurry of emotions and unwavering dedication. Initially, her law firm was apprehensive, fearing that her public case would undermine their meticulously cultivated reputation. However, Camille maintained his composure. She articulated with composure yet determination that this conflict was not solely about her, it was about establishing a precedent. The viral video had not only disseminated her narrative, but it had also initiated discussions throughout the city and beyond. Camille's footage, which captured her serene yet defiant demeanor as the officers forcibly led her away, became a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Camille declined all requests for interviews from reporters who began to contact her. She was not interested in media attention. Her attention was singularly directed toward the development of a case that would not only make the officers accountable but also reveal the systemic deficiencies that permitted such misconduct to endure. However, the gravity of the situation began to sink in at night, when the world fell silent. She relived the arrest in her mind, recalling the dismissive tone, the restraints, and the murmurs of the crowd. She contemplated the potential for the situation to have escalated even further. The idea caused her stomach to turn, but it also served as an incentive for her to remain resolute. Marissa dropped by with takeout one evening as she reviewed her research. Marissa placed the food on the table, and Camille scarcely glanced up from her laptop. Marissa tenderly stated, "You have been engaged in this activity for an extended period of time." Camille responded immediately, "I am unable to make a decision." Marissa sat across from her, examining her features. "You know this is bigger than just a legal battle, right? People are looking to you now." Camille ultimately met her friend's gaze as she closed her laptop. "I am aware," she replied, her tone remaining unwavering. "That's why I can afford to lose." Her preparation was meticulous. She examined comparable cases, accumulating evidence and citing precedents to undermine the officers' assertions. She formed a legal team that was dedicated to her pursuit of justice and sought the assistance of reliable colleagues. However, the courtroom was not the sole focus. Camille also prioritized community involvement. She participated in town hall meetings, listened to individuals who had encountered comparable injustices, and even delivered a speech at a nearby college regarding the significance of accountability. A stranger approached her as she walked to her vehicle after a meeting one afternoon. The woman inquired hesitantly, "Miss Johnson?" "Yes?" The woman's voice cracked as she said, "I simply wanted to express my gratitude for standing up to them. For standing up for all of us." Camille experienced a sensation of constriction in her larynx. She was able to maintain a modest expression. "I'm just doing what I can." The community's assistance was a double-edged instrument. It increased the strain, but it also empowered her. She was unable to disappoint them. Subsequently, her attorney contacted her with some news. The officers you're suing have filed a motion to dismiss the case. Camille anticipated this outcome. It was customary to postpone the procedure. However, she was paralyzed as her attorney detailed the subsequent procedures. "Camille," he indicated with caution, "you should know something else. You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The irony was astounding. Camille reclined in her chair, contemplating the revelation. She had spent weeks preparing to challenge these officers in court, and now fate had dealt her an entirely different form of justice. She briefly contemplated whether she could accomplish the task, whether she could sit on that bench and maintain her impartiality. Nevertheless, she reflected on the ordeals they had subjected her to. Regarding the individuals who were reliant on her to take a stand, this was not a mere coincidence. It was an opportunity to demonstrate the true nature of justice. As individuals entered the courtroom and located their seats, there was a gentle hum of conversation. The case was not particularly high profile, an internal misconduct proceeding that involved two officers who were accused of using excessive force in an unrelated incident. For the majority, it was simply another day in the justice system. Carter and Daniels, the two officers, sat at the defendant's table, their uniforms resembling armor. They spoke in subdued tones, leaning toward one another, their expressions indifferent, almost bored. This was ordinary to them. An additional obstacle to overcome. An additional instance that should be disregarded. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room fell quiet. Camille ascended the bench, her black robe trailing behind her. She moved with purpose, her demeanor simultaneously composed and authoritative. She peered at the defendants as she sat down. The response was immediate. Officer Carter's eyes widened in astonishment, and his face was devoid of color. Daniel's jaw tightened as he struggled to comprehend the images he was witnessing, causing him to shift uneasily. It was she. The woman who was detained and humiliated in the park. Camille granted a fleeting respite, allowing the gravity of the situation to settle in the room. Subsequently, she initiated the proceedings with a voice that was both clear and steady. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers' composure was waning as they sat rigidly. Carter whispered something to their counsel, who nodded but maintained his attention on Camille. Camille experienced a sense of empowerment for the first time in weeks. However, she was aware that this was not about retribution. She would maintain the impartiality that was required of her in her capacity as a justice. Nevertheless, the irony was not wasted on her or any other individual in the room. Camille maintained her professionalism by attentively hearing and taking notes as the attorneys presented their opening arguments. However, her attention would occasionally shift to the officers. She observed the minor fidgeting of their hands and the tension in their shoulders. Carter and Daniels entered the hallway during a recess, their voices subdued but agitated. Carter's frustration was scarcely contained as he hissed, "How is she the judge?" Daniels murmured, shaking his head, "This must be a setup." Their attorney interrupted, "It is not a ruse. It's a coincidence. And you need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here, your actions are." Regrettably, the officers were not listening. They were excessively preoccupied with the surreal nature of their situation. Camille maintained his composure as the court resumed, guaranteeing that the hearing was conducted in a fair and efficient manner. Nevertheless, the defendants appeared to be unsettled by her mere presence. Their confidence was gradually eroded as they shifted in their seats each time she addressed them. Camille observed Carter steal a glimpse at her during witness testimony at one point. His expression was not indicative of defiance. It was more akin to remorse. As if he was beginning to comprehend the gravity of their actions. The tension in the courtroom was palpable by the conclusion of the day. The hearing was adjourned by Camille, who struck her gavel with finality. She declared, "We will convene at 9 a.m. tomorrow." Camille remained at her bench, arranging her notes, as the room emptied. She could sense the weight of the officers' gaze as they hesitated by the door, evidently deliberating whether to approach her. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful. They departed silently, their steps laden with the realization that this was far from over. However, the genuine obstacle for Camille was not the absurdity of the situation. It was in the subsequent decisions and the potential for justice to genuinely prevail. The following morning, the courtroom was overstuffed. The misconduct hearing attracted a larger audience than usual as a result of the unexpected twist that had been disclosed. Some individuals were present out of fascination. Camille received assistance from others, despite their awareness that her position as a judge precluded her from exhibiting any favoritism. Camille ascended to the bench with the same placid, composed demeanor, her robe flowing. The attorneys promptly initiated their arguments. The prosecutor meticulously presented testimony from the victim of the excessive force incident in order to establish evidence against the officers. Your Honor, according to the prosecutor, the officers' actions were not just a lapse in judgment. They were a blatant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the very people they are sworn to protect. Camille nodded, her pen gliding across her notepad as she absorbed each word. Even as the defendants shifted uneasily under her gaze, her concentration remained unwavering. The defense counsel rose to respond, his demeanor measured yet strained. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident in question, we argue that the situation escalated due to factors beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe this case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures. Camille was unable to disregard the similarities between this case and her personal experience as the arguments persisted. The justifications, the excuses, they were all too familiar. However, she was resolute in her determination to rely on the facts and set aside her personal emotions. When witness cross-examinations were scheduled, the tension in the room intensified. The victim, a young man named Ethan, was summoned to the stand by the prosecutor. He trembled as he recollected the night in which he was dragged to the ground by the officers during a routine traffic stop. They did not even allow me to provide an explanation, Ethan stated, his eyes shifting nervously. Before I had the opportunity to speak, it appeared as though the attorneys and the officers had already determined my culpability. The prosecutor continued to urge. And did you resist their orders at any point? No, Ethan replied with a firm voice. I was scared, but I did everything they said. It was of no consequence. They were already certain of their decision. The defense attorney stood to cross-examine, and the room was silent. He endeavored to undermine Ethan's testimony, however, the young man refused to yield. Camille observed with rapt attention, her expression rendering it impossible to interpret. Then, the moment that had been anticipated by all arrived. The defendants were summoned to testify. Officer Carter was the initial witness to testify. He nervously looked at Camille as he swore the oath, his voice trembling as he responded to the prosecutor's inquiries. Officer Carter, the prosecutor introduced himself, you've been accused of using excessive force in this incident. Can you explain your actions that night? Carter hesitated, his eyes briefly diverting to Daniel's, before responding. I thought the situation was escalating. I made a judgment call. And do you believe your actions were justified? Carter adjusted in his seat. At the time, yes. But looking back, I could have handled it differently. The prosecutor persisted. Handled it differently how? By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground? Carter opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His silence conveyed a great deal. Daniel's demeanor was similarly strained when it was his turn to testify. The prosecutor's case was only exacerbated by his efforts to rationalize his actions, which underscored the officer's incapacity to accept responsibility. Camille maintained an attentive demeanor, her expression remaining devoid of emotion. However, within her, she experienced a combination of pity and frustration. These individuals were granted authority, however, they exercised it carelessly, resulting in a trail of destruction in their aftermath. The overwhelming nature of the evidence against the officers became apparent as the day progressed. The prosecutor's closing argument was persuasive, as it compelled the court to establish a precedent that abuse of power would not be tolerated. It was evident that the defense was fumbling for straws when it delivered its closing statement. Their arguments were lacking in conviction, and the officers themselves appeared to be accepting of the probable outcome. Camille announced that a ruling would be issued the following week as she adjourned the hearing. Her voice remained unwavering. Carter and Daniels remained in the vicinity of the exit as the courtroom deserted, their expressions emaciated and apprehensive. For the first time, they appeared to comprehend the severity of their actions and the actuality of the situation that lay ahead. However, justice was not solely concerned with punishment. It was about preventing the recurrence of prior errors, ensuring accountability, and implementing change. Camille entered the courtroom to deliver her ruling, and the chamber was entirely silent. This occurred 1 week later. The tension was almost palpable, as every seat was filled. As the back wall was lined with reporters, their pens were poised to record each word. This was no longer merely a case involving two officers. It had become a representation of a more extensive struggle for accountability and justice. Camille initiated her speech with a composed yet authoritative tone. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, it erodes public trust and causes harm far beyond the immediate victim. This case has laid bare the consequences of such actions. Her eyes scanned the room as she paused. Carter and Daniels sat at the defense table with their heads bent. The significance of her words was undeniable. The evidence presented has demonstrated that officers Carter and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold. Their actions were not only unjustified but indicative of a troubling pattern that must be addressed. Camille delineated the repercussions: compulsory suspension without pay, enrollment in comprehensive rehabilitation programs, and a formal disciplinary record that would follow. The ruling was equitable and firm, striking a balance between accountability and the potential for reform. Camille concluded the case with a decisive gavel strike after she had completed. "This court is adjourned." The officers stood, their expression solemn as they prepared to depart. Carter hesitated and then turned to Camille before exiting. "Your Honor," he began, his voice scarcely audible. "I'm sorry. It was insufficient to rectify the damage, but it was a beginning." Camille nodded in agreement, acknowledging his statements without extending an apology. She was aware that genuine change would be achieved through actions, not apologies. Camille remained seated, allowing himself a moment to contemplate, as the courtroom deserted. She had witnessed the administration of justice, however, the triumph was melancholy. Numerous cases similar to this one were left unresolved and unacknowledged. Camille attended a community meeting at a nearby recreation center later that evening. The space was brimming with individuals who were eager to express their aspirations, frustrations, and stories. She experienced a revitalized sense of purpose as she listened. Following the meeting, an elderly woman approached her, her voice quivering with emotion. "Thank you," she replied, firmly grasping Camille's hand. "What you did in that courtroom, it means the world to us." Camille's smile was gentle. "This is just the beginning. We have so much more work to do." Community leaders, law enforcement, and local activists engaged in substantive discussions during the subsequent week. Camille leveraged her platform to promote reforms, underscoring the necessity of transparency and accountability in the field of law enforcement. The case had a far-reaching impact, not only in Fort Collins but throughout the state. People began to demand change, advocating for policies that prioritize equality and equity. The voyage was not about personal vindication for Camille. It was about guaranteeing that others would not be necessary to endure the same as she had. Although the struggle for justice was ongoing, instances such as this served as a reminder that change was feasible, albeit at a glacial pace. On a particular afternoon, she observed a peaceful rally of young activists as she stood on the steps of the courthouse. She was filled with a sense of optimism. Although the system was not flawless, it could be advanced with the support of a sufficient number of voices. She believed that this was the type of justice that was worth fighting for. If you are a proponent of accountability and transformation, please consider subscribing to our channel for additional narratives that motivate action and contemplation. Let us collaborate to create a more equitable universe.